A liberal journalist mocks Barron Trump in public, but his response made her look stupid. The evening air carried the hum of conversation as people gathered in the bustling city square. Bright lights from nearby shops and restaurants reflected off the cobblestone streets, and a group of onlookers had formed around a small makeshift stage where a news crew had set up. Microphones were adjusted, cameras flickered on, and an unmistakable energy of anticipation filled the air. A well-dressed journalist, known for her sharp tongue and no-nonsense interviews, stood confidently at the center, her face illuminated by the bright glow of the camera lights. She turned to her crew, adjusting the wireless mic clipped to her lapel. "All right, let's make this interesting," she murmured, flashing a smile that was both calculated and assured. The journalist was Lydia Monroe, a veteran media personality famous for her confrontational interviews. She had built her reputation on challenging politicians and public figures, often embarrassing them in front of live audiences. Her technique was clear: push, press, provoke, and when necessary, pounce. And tonight, she had found her next target. Standing just outside the immediate crowd, Barron Trump observed the scene quietly. Dressed in a sharp, well-tailored black suit, he stood out not because of his name, but because of the composed aura he carried. He had inherited his father's unmistakable presence, but carried himself with a grace that was uniquely his own. Barron wasn't looking for trouble. In fact, he had initially planned to remain in the background, content with being just another face in the crowd. He had grown up under the scrutiny of cameras, whispered speculation, and the weight of public perception. He was used to people making assumptions before he even said a word. But as fate would have it, Lydia Monroe had already spotted him. And in her eyes, he was an irresistible opportunity. She turned her attention to him with a smile that was anything but warm. Well, she said, her voice amplified through the microphone, drawing the crowd's attention to the young man standing calmly at the edge of the group. "Looks like we have someone particularly special with us tonight. Ladies and gentlemen, in case you haven't noticed, we have Barron Trump in our presence." A ripple of murmurs ran through the crowd. Some people perked up with curiosity, others whispered to each other, recognizing the name instantly. Cameras panned to capture Barron's reaction, but he remained still, his expression unreadable. Lydia took a step forward, brandishing her microphone like a weapon. "Barron," she continued, her tone saccharine sweet, "I don't think we've ever had the pleasure of speaking before, have we?" Barron regarded her with a steady gaze, his posture relaxed but firm. "No, we haven't." "Well, that's just a shame," she said, feigning disappointment. "But lucky for us, tonight's the night. And what better way to have a conversation than right here, with the American people watching?" A few chuckles rippled through the audience. Lydia knew exactly what she was doing. She had crafted her words carefully, presenting this as a spontaneous moment when, in reality, she had already decided how she wanted this exchange to go. Barron remained unmoved. "That depends on the kind of conversation you're looking for." Lydia smirked at the response, sensing an opening. "Oh, I'm sure we'll find plenty to talk about," she said smoothly. "You know, people are always curious about you, Barron. You're one of the most famous young men in the country, yet you don't say much. I guess that makes sense, given how much of your life has been handed to you. No real struggles, no hardships, no experience in the real world. That must be nice." The subtle jab landed exactly as she intended. The audience shifted, some eyes flickering toward Barron, waiting to see how he would react. Barron didn't flinch. He had been through enough to recognize a baited question when he heard one. "Are you asking me a question?" he said evenly, "or just making assumptions?" The response was met with a few quiet laughs, and Lydia's smile twitched slightly. She recovered quickly, though, tilting her head. "Oh, come on. Surely you understand what I mean. People want to know, how can someone like you, born into wealth, possibly understand what everyday Americans go through?" Another murmur of interest passed through the crowd. Lydia had framed the question in a way that made it seem like an undeniable fact. Barron Trump was privileged, disconnected, out of touch. Barron met her gaze, considering her words carefully before responding. "I could ask you the same thing," he said finally. Lydia blinked. "Excuse me? You're a journalist," Barron continued, his tone polite but pointed. You live in expensive cities, attend elite events, and interview politicians. What experience do you have with the struggles of the average American? A few people in the crowd reacted audibly. Lydia's expression flickered, but she quickly regained her composure. That's a clever deflection, she countered. But I'm not the one whose family has controlled the White House. Barron exhaled softly, as if he had already anticipated this angle. If that's the measure, then let's talk about politicians who've been in office for decades, shaping policies while barely spending time outside their elite circles. If your concern is about people in power being disconnected, why single me out? The tension in the air was thick now. Lydia, for the first time, appeared slightly unsettled. Because, she said, pressing forward, you're a Trump. And Trumps have a history of being out of touch with reality. The words hung in the air, and for the first time, Barron's expression shifted ever so slightly. It wasn't anger. It was something more dangerous, calculated patience. He didn't raise his voice, didn't let any emotion slip through his tone. You keep saying that, he said calmly, but you haven't actually asked me a real question yet? The journalist faltered for just a fraction of a second, barely noticeable, but enough for the crowd to pick up on. A smirk tugged at the corner of Barron's lips, but he didn't push it. He let her words settle in, let the audience absorb the interaction. Lydia cleared her throat, shifting tactics. All right, fine, she said, waving a hand dismissively. Let's get to a real question then. What do you think is the biggest issue facing America right now? Barron took a moment, tilting his head slightly as he considered his response. That depends, he said. Do you want the answer that fits your narrative, or the actual truth? The shift in the crowd was immediate. Someone let out an audible, "Oh," and a few people chuckled. Lydia straightened, clearly not expecting that level of pushback. Let's hear it, she said, trying to maintain control. Barron nodded slightly. The biggest issue? Accountability. From politicians, from corporations, from the media. People are tired of watching those in power manipulate information while pretending they're doing it for the greater good. Lydia's smile tightened. That's a vague answer. It's an honest one, Barron countered. People are struggling to trust institutions that have failed them repeatedly. They see journalists more interested in crafting narratives than reporting facts. They see politicians more focused on staying in power than actually helping people. They see corporate leaders exploiting them while pretending to care. And the worst part? No one ever admits when they're wrong. The cycle just continues. The crowd had gone silent now, absorbing every word. Lydia could feel the energy shifting against her, and for the first time in a long while, she realized she was losing control of the conversation. Lydia forced a laugh, shaking her head as if Barron's words were amusing rather than incisive. But there was something in her eyes, an unease she couldn't quite hide. The crowd had noticed it too. The shift in energy was unmistakable. She had approached Barron assuming he would be flustered, defensive, maybe even overwhelmed. Instead, he was poised, articulate, and worst of all, unshaken. Well, she said, gripping her microphone a little tighter, that's a very diplomatic answer. But let's be honest here, Barron. When people talk about accountability, they usually mean holding people like you accountable. The elite. The privileged. Barron exhaled quietly, as if he had already anticipated her comeback. He studied her for a moment before responding. If that's the case, then let's hold everyone accountable, not just the people who are convenient targets. Let's talk about the media spreading misinformation without consequences. Let's talk about career politicians who get re-elected after decades of failure. Let's talk about corporations that fund campaigns and then miraculously get laws passed in their favor. Lydia opened her mouth to respond, but Barron wasn't finished. You see, it's easy to stand here and point fingers at one group of people while ignoring the rest. But that's not accountability, that's just selective outrage. The crowd murmured in agreement. A few even clapped. Lydia's expression remained neutral, but inside, she knew she had underestimated him. She had expected an easy target, someone young, unprepared, incapable of handling pressure. Instead, Barron was turning the conversation against her, and worse, he was making sense. Well, she said, tilting her head slightly, That's an interesting perspective. But I have to ask, Barron, what makes you think you understand the struggles of everyday Americans? What experience do you have that qualifies you to even speak on these issues? Barron didn't flinch. He had heard this argument before, countless times. It was the same tired tactic: disqualify the speaker rather than engage with the argument. I could ask you the same thing, he said smoothly. You've spent most of your career in major cities, surrounded by other journalists and politicians. You live in a world of media narratives and curated perspectives. When was the last time you had a real conversation with someone outside of that bubble? The journalist blinked. Excuse me? I'm asking, Barron said, his tone patient but firm. When was the last time you talked to a factory worker in Ohio? A single mother working 2 jobs? A veteran struggling with healthcare? Because if you haven't, then by your logic, you're not qualified to speak on these issues either. The crowd reacted audibly this time. Some laughed, others gasped. Lydia's jaw tightened slightly, and she quickly forced a smile. That's a clever deflection, she said, her voice measured. But the difference is, I report on these issues. I interview experts. I study the data. And yet, Barron replied, you still manage to get things wrong. The air between them was electric now. Lydia had gone into this expecting to lead the conversation, but Barron had flipped the dynamic entirely. He wasn't flustered. He wasn't scrambling. He was calm, methodical, and in complete control. Lydia exhaled, adjusting her stance. All right, Barron. Let's talk specifics. Since you seem to think the media lacks accountability, tell me, what's the biggest lie you think the media has spread in the last decade? Barron considered her for a moment, then smiled faintly. Do you really want me to answer that? The journalist hesitated. There was something about the way he said it, so calm, so assured, that made her uneasy. But she had no choice now. Go ahead, she said, keeping her voice steady. Barron nodded. All right, the biggest lie? That the media is neutral. The audience reacted immediately. Some clapped, others murmured. Lydia's expression didn't change, but there was a flicker of something, annoyance, maybe even concern. That's a bold claim, she said, folding her arms. Care to elaborate? Of course, Barron said easily. The media loves to present itself as an objective observer, simply reporting facts. But that's not true, is it? Every major news outlet has an agenda. Some lean left, some lean right, but none of them are truly neutral. And the worst part? They pretend they are. That's an oversimplification, Lydia countered quickly. Journalists are trained to report facts, not opinions. Then why do so many stories feel like opinions disguised as facts? Barron shot back. Why do we see headlines that frame events in a specific way before people even have a chance to hear the full story? Why do some narratives get endless coverage while others are buried? Lydia opened her mouth, then closed it again. She could feel the conversation slipping further from her control. She had expected to corner Barron, but now she was the one on the defensive. She forced another laugh. All right, Barron. You're clearly very media savvy. But let's step away from politics for a moment. Let's talk about you. A lot of people wonder, what's it like growing up as Barron Trump? It was a pivot, a desperate one. But Barron allowed it. I think a better question, he said, is what people assume it's like. Lydia smiled, sensing an opportunity. All right, let's talk assumptions. People assume you've never faced hardship, that you've lived a life of luxury, completely disconnected from reality. Barron exhaled slowly, looking out at the crowd. And what does that say about people's expectations? Lydia blinked. What do you mean? I mean, Barron said, turning his gaze back to her, that people assume if you have money, you must not have any real problems. That if you grow up in privilege, your life is easy. But life isn't that simple. Money doesn't shield you from loss, from criticism, from pressure. It doesn't stop people from making assumptions about you before you even open your mouth. The audience was silent now, fully invested. People assume I've never worked hard because I was born into wealth. They assume I have nothing meaningful to say because I grew up in a famous family. But assumptions are dangerous. They stop people from listening. Lydia cleared her throat. So you're saying what? That you've had it just as hard as anyone else? No, Barron said simply. I'm saying that hardship comes in different forms. And that dismissing someone's experiences just because they don't fit a certain narrative is dishonest. For the first time, Lydia had no immediate response. The crowd was no longer on her side. She had come into this expecting to expose Barron Trump as out of touch, but instead, he had exposed the flaws in her argument. Barron let the silence stretch for just a moment longer, then offered a small, knowing smile. Are we done here? Lydia hesitated. She wanted to regain control, to turn the conversation back in her favor. But she knew it was over. She forced a tight smile and nodded. I think we've covered enough. Barron nodded back. Good. With that, he turned, walking away without another word. The crowd, still buzzing from the exchange, watched him go. Some clapped. Others murmured among themselves. But one thing was clear, Barron Trump had just won. Lydia stood there for a long moment, microphone still in hand, realizing that for the first time in a long time, she was the one left speechless. Lydia Monroe remained standing in the middle of the crowd, her grip tightening around the microphone as she tried to process what had just happened. The cameras were still rolling, capturing every detail. The way Barron had effortlessly turned her tactics against her, the way the crowd had shifted, and most damning of all, the silence that now followed his departure. She wasn't used to this. In every other interview, she had been the one controlling the narrative, steering the conversation, and dictating the perception of her subjects. Yet now, she was the one left standing in the uncomfortable limelight, her carefully crafted approach unraveled in front of a live audience. The murmurs among the crowd grew. Some people were exchanging knowing glances, while others were replaying Barron's words in their heads, realizing how neatly he had deconstructed Lydia's arguments without breaking a sweat. A few younger onlookers had even taken out their phones, already scrolling through social media to see if the clip was spreading. And it was fast. Lydia inhaled sharply. She needed to regain control, or at least appear to. With a forced smile, she turned back to the camera. Well, she said, her voice carrying a strained cheerfulness, that was certainly an interesting conversation. Barron Trump, everyone. A man of many words. A few people chuckled awkwardly, but most just watched her, their expressions unreadable. Lydia wasn't sure whether to continue or cut the segment entirely. The producer in her earpiece hesitated as well, unsure whether to push forward or salvage what little dignity she had left. Before she could decide, a voice called from the crowd. You never answered his question. Lydia stiffened, her forced smile flickering slightly. She turned toward the voice, only to find a middle-aged man staring at her, arms crossed. He wasn't mocking her. He wasn't smiling. He was simply waiting like everyone else. What question? She asked, playing dumb. The man shrugged. When was the last time you spoke to a struggling single mother or a veteran? He asked you that, remember? Lydia's jaw tightened. This was exactly what she had been afraid of. I speak to people all the time, she responded smoothly, adjusting her stance. That's my job. The man nodded. Sure. But you dodged it. He asked when, and you didn't answer. A few people in the crowd muttered in agreement. Lydia forced a small laugh, but it was clear to everyone watching that her confidence was thinning by the second. That's not really the point, she said, waving a hand dismissively. This wasn't about me. Maybe it should be, the man countered. More murmurs. More eyes on her. She didn't like this. Lydia turned back toward the cameras, plastering on a tight-lipped smile. All right, she said, forcing some authority back into her tone. I think we've given Barron Trump enough airtime for tonight. Let's move on to... No, let's not. Another voice. This time, a young woman in the crowd. She was standing toward the front, arms crossed, an amused smirk tugging at her lips. Lydia tensed. She had spent years perfecting the art of controlling conversations, but tonight, the balance of power had shifted. Now, the crowd was leading her. The young woman continued, You went after him, expecting him to slip up. But he didn't. And now, you're the one backpedaling. Just admit it. Lydia's smile faded slightly. Admit what? That you lost, the young woman said simply. A wave of laughter rippled through the crowd, but it wasn't malicious. It was the kind of laugh that came from people who had just witnessed something extraordinary, something unexpected. Lydia felt her pulse quicken. She needed to shut this down now. "I think it's a bit dramatic to call this a competition," she said, keeping her voice even. "This was an interview, not a debate." The young woman raised an eyebrow. "Was it? Because from where I'm standing, it sure looked like one. And you lost?" The laughter grew louder. Lydia clenched her jaw. "I think that's enough questions from the audience," she said sharply, looking back toward the cameras. "Let's move on." But she wasn't going to be allowed that luxury. From the back of the crowd, another voice chimed in. "You know what the best part is?" Lydia turned, her patience wearing dangerously thin. "What's that?" A young man grinned, holding up his phone. "This is already trending. You just made Barron Trump look like the most articulate guy in politics, and you did it on live TV." Lydia's stomach dropped. She knew what that meant. She had spent years crafting her brand, an intelligent, sharp-witted journalist who could outmaneuver anyone in a public debate. And in a matter of minutes, Barron Trump had done what few had managed. He hadn't just defended himself. He had flipped the entire conversation against her, leaving her scrambling for a way out. And worse, he had done it effortlessly. The voices in her earpiece were frantic now. Her producer was whispering rapid instructions, trying to salvage the broadcast, but Lydia wasn't sure there was anything left to save. She swallowed hard, gripping the microphone. "We're going to take a quick break," she announced. "Stay with us." The cameras cut. The crew scrambled. The crowd, however, remained locked in place, buzzing with excitement. Barron Trump had left the stage, but his presence still loomed large. Meanwhile, just a few blocks away, Barron walked along the quiet streets, hands tucked into his pockets. He had never set out to humiliate Lydia Monroe. That wasn't his goal. But he had recognized her tactics the moment she started speaking. She had expected arrogance. She had expected privilege. She hadn't expected him. His phone vibrated in his pocket. He pulled it out and glanced at the notifications. Social media was already on fire. His name was trending. Clips of the interview had already racked up hundreds of thousands of views, and the reactions were overwhelmingly in his favor. Some were calling it the greatest media takedown of the decade. Others were dubbing it the night Lydia Monroe's career ended. Barron wasn't interested in any of that. He had said what he had wanted to say. That was enough. He turned a corner, stepping into the warm glow of a small cafe. The place was quiet, nearly empty, which was exactly what he needed right now. As he waited for his order, his phone vibrated again. This time, it was a text. "Unknown number, impressive performance tonight." Barron frowned slightly, debating whether to ignore it. But before he could decide, another message appeared. "Unknown number, you're going to need to get used to this. Because after tonight, they're going to come after you harder than ever." Barron exhaled through his nose. He already knew that. What happened tonight wasn't just another interview. It was a shift, a turning point. And the media? They weren't going to let it slide. But Barron? He was ready. Barron took a slow sip of his coffee, his eyes scanning the messages on his phone. The night's events were still unfolding, and even though he had stepped away from the scene, the echoes of his words were reverberating across the internet. Social media was ablaze. The headlines were already popping up. Barron Trump shuts down liberal journalist on live TV. Lydia Monroe's worst interview yet, completely outmatched. Media spin backfires as Barron Trump turns the tables. Video clips had gone viral, spreading across platforms at a speed that only controversy could fuel. Some were celebrating his performance, calling it the moment he stepped into the political arena whether he wanted to or not. Others were scrambling to defend Lydia, claiming she had been ambushed in her own interview. Barron chuckled softly at that one. Ambushed? He hadn't done anything except answer her questions honestly. The bell over the cafe door jingled as someone stepped inside. He barely noticed until he heard the sound of hurried footsteps approaching his table. He looked up. It was a young woman, maybe in her mid-20s, out of breath from what seemed like a frantic jog. She was clutching her phone, her eyes wide as she stared at him. "You're him," she blurted out. "You're Barron Trump." He nodded, not sure what to expect. Over the years, he had encountered people who either adored or despised him based solely on his last name. It was rare to meet someone who saw him as just a person. "I just watched the interview," she said, still catching her breath. "But I can't believe it. That was insane." He raised an eyebrow. "Insane how?" She pulled out her phone, waving it slightly. "I mean, I thought she was going to tear you apart. That's what she does. But you just stood there, totally calm. You didn't even raise your voice, and somehow, you still completely dismantled her." Barron shrugged. "I just answered her questions." The woman scoffed. "Yeah, and made her look like an idiot in the process." Barron sighed, placing his coffee down. "That wasn't my goal." She paused, studying him. "Then what was?" He leaned back slightly, choosing his words carefully. "People assume things about me before I even open my mouth. They decide who I am, what I think, what I believe. Tonight, I wanted to show them that assumptions don't equal truth." She nodded slowly, understanding settling in. "Well, you definitely did that." Her phone buzzed, and she glanced at it before looking back at him. "Listen, I won't take up your time, but I just wanted to say, people needed to hear that. Not just because of who you are, but because of what you said. That's rare these days." Barron offered a small smile. "I appreciate that." She returned the smile before stepping back. "I'll let you get back to your night. But, good luck. I have a feeling things are about to get crazy for you." Barron didn't doubt it. Back at the television studio, Lydia Monroe was pacing the length of her dressing room, her phone pressed against her ear as she spoke with her producer. "This is ridiculous," she snapped. "One interview, and suddenly the entire internet is acting like I was obliterated? It wasn't even that bad." On the other end, her producer sighed. "Lydia, you need to understand, this was different." Barron didn't just push back, he controlled the conversation. That's not what people expect from him. And because of that, it's making headlines. Lydia clenched her jaw. She had worked too hard to build her reputation, and she wasn't about to let one conversation with a politician's son ruin it. "We need to do damage control," she said firmly. "Spin it. Say he avoided real questions. Say he was disrespectful." "Lydia." The producer's voice was tired now. "The whole interview is online. People can see what happened for themselves. If we try to spin this too hard, it's only going to make us look worse." She knew he was right, and she hated it. With a frustrated groan, she threw her phone onto the couch and stared at herself in the mirror. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The next morning, Barron woke to an onslaught of messages. Texts, emails, missed calls. Some from people he hadn't spoken to in years. Others from names he had never seen before. His father had called too. Twice. He exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck as he scrolled through the notifications. As expected, the conversation from the night before had exploded beyond anything he could have predicted. He turned on the TV, flipping through news channels. Everywhere, the same story. What last night's interview means for Barron Trump's future. Lydia Monroe faces backlash after awkward exchange. A new political voice? Barron Trump's unexpected media moment. Some pundits speculated that this was his unofficial entry into politics. Others warned that the media would now see him as a threat and work harder to undermine him. He had never wanted to be a politician. But last night had shown him something important. People were starving for honesty. For someone who wouldn't talk in circles, who wouldn't play the same political games that had exhausted the public for decades. And now, he was in the conversation whether he wanted to be or not. His phone buzzed again. Another unknown number. He hesitated before answering. "Hello." A familiar voice came through the line. Calm, measured. Someone who had been watching from a distance for a long time. "Well done," the voice said. "Now, are you ready for what comes next?" Barron didn't respond immediately. He looked out the window, watching as the city came to life outside. Things were about to change. He could feel it. And for the first time in a long time, he was ready.